You ever wonder what life was really like in medieval times? Forget the fairy tales, the movies, and the Instagram filters. This wasn't a world of chivalrous knights, grand castles, or flawless maidens. Nope. It was a brutal, relentless existence where every single day tested your grit, your sanity, and your very survival. And honestly, if you think you could handle it today, think again. Because the reality was harsh beyond what we usually imagine, and it was shaped by struggles so deep and challenges so raw. They make modern life's annoyances look like a luxury. Picture this. You wake up in a tiny, cramped wooden hut with a dirt floor, the smell of smoke and animals heavy in the air. The roof leaks, the wind whips through the cracks, and the cold from the night has seeped into your bones. No soft sheets, no warm central heating, just a hard bed made of straw, or maybe nothing at all. Outside, the village is stirring to life, but the threat of disease, hunger, and violence lurks just beneath the surface of every quiet morning. Medieval times stretched roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, 1,000 years of history filled with warfare, famine, religious upheaval, and social chaos. But what's often glossed over is the daily reality, the overwhelming hardship that shaped the way people lived, worked, and died. The so-called Dark Ages were not just a period of cultural stagnation, they were a time when humanity faced some of its toughest challenges. And while we romanticize knights and kings, the average person was trapped in a cycle of toil and survival that most of us today can barely imagine. Let's start with something simple but fundamental: food. We tend to think medieval people ate hearty feasts with roasted meats and rich pies. But that was mostly reserved for the nobility. For peasants and common folk, meals were meager and repetitive. Bread, if you were lucky, made from coarse grains, often mixed with whatever else could be found, sometimes even sawdust or ground bones during famines. Vegetables were seasonal, and meat was a rare luxury, often limited to small game or scraps. Malnutrition was rampant, weakening immune systems and making people vulnerable to disease. Speaking of disease, this period was a nightmare for health. Without modern medicine, even minor injuries or infections could be fatal. The Black Death alone wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Imagine towns and villages emptied overnight, mass graves filling the earth, the stench of death everywhere. And it wasn't just plague. Smallpox, leprosy, tuberculosis, and countless other illnesses ravaged communities constantly. Hygiene was poor, and the close quarters and crowded villages made contagion inevitable. But the hardships didn't stop at food and disease. The social structure was rigid, and for most people, life was tied to the land in a feudal system that demanded loyalty and labor for a lord who often cared little for your well-being. Peasants worked from dawn till dusk, tending fields with primitive tools, paying taxes in the form of crops or labor, and living under constant threat of eviction, punishment, or worse. There was little chance to rise above. Your station serfs were legally bound to their lord's land, and freedom was a rare gift. Violence was a part of everyday life too. Raids, local feuds, and wars were common. Knights in shining armor might sound heroic, but beneath the surface, warfare was brutal and bloody. Battles meant not just combat between armies, but also the devastation of entire regions, with villages burned, crops destroyed, and civilians caught in the crossfire. Law enforcement was patchy at best, and banditry thrived. If you thought walking home alone after dark is risky now, try it in medieval England, with thieves, and worse, lurking in the shadows. And then, there's the environment itself, a world without modern infrastructure. Roads were dirt and mud tracks that turned into quagmires in rain. Travel was slow, dangerous, and often unnecessary for most. Sanitation was primitive. Waste disposal was rudimentary, with people often dumping refuse into the streets or nearby rivers, poisoning water supplies. This made disease and discomfort everyday companions. But here's where it gets even more intense. Medieval life was not just about enduring external hardships. It was about the constant psychological strain of living with uncertainty. The church held immense power, dictating not just spiritual life, but political and social rules. Fear of divine punishment was real and pervasive. Every illness, famine, or misfortune was often seen as a sign of God's wrath. Religious festivals and rituals punctuated the year, but alongside them, superstition and fear of witches, demons, and curses were rampant. Children, who today represent hope and future, were often viewed differently. Infant mortality was extremely high. Many families lost multiple children to disease and malnutrition. Childhood was short, and children were expected to contribute to the household's survival from a very young age. Now, why can't you handle it? Because modern comforts have numbed us to just how precarious life was. We have heat, clean water, medicine, reliable food, and protections that our medieval ancestors could barely dream of. We don't face the daily grind of survival that dominated every waking moment for centuries. And psychologically, the medieval mindset rooted in survival, fear, faith, and rigid social roles is foreign to us. The stress alone would be overwhelming. But to truly understand, we have to dig deeper. We have to peel back the layers of myth and romanticism to see what people wore, what they ate, how they worked, how they fought to survive every single day. We need to explore their homes, their villages, their fields, and the brutal world outside the castle walls. So buckle up. We're about to take a journey back in time, warts and all, to the medieval world as it really was. Not the sanitized, movie-friendly version, but the raw, relentless reality that shaped our history and still echoes in our culture today. Life in the medieval era was a daily battle against nature, poverty, and the unforgiving social order that shaped every aspect of existence. To truly grasp what it was like and why modern people would struggle to handle it, we need to zoom in on the details of everyday life. This means exploring the homes, the diets, the work, and the brutal realities of survival that no Hollywood movie will show you, starting with homes. Most medieval peasants didn't live in castles or stone cottages. Their houses were small, cramped, and made of the cheapest, most accessible materials, usually wood, wattle, and daub. Walls were often made by weaving branches or reeds, and then covering them in a mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The roofs were thatched with dried straw or reeds, easily flammable, and fragile against storms. Inside, there was usually just one room, serving as kitchen, bedroom, and living area all at once. Furniture was sparse: a rough wooden bench, a table made of planks, and a simple bed of straw or hay that offered little comfort. These beds were often shared by entire families. The floor was simply packed earth, or sometimes covered with rushes that helped to absorb waste and dirt, but had to be replaced regularly. Cold drafts crept in through cracks in the walls and under doors, making winter months brutal. Heating was provided by a central hearth, often just a fire pit on the floor. There were no chimneys in early medieval homes, so smoke filled the room, making the eyes water and lungs ache. The smoke did have a practical purpose, helping to preserve food and keep insects away, but it also meant that people were exposed to constant inhalation of soot and ash, long before we understood the dangers of indoor air pollution. Sanitation was primitive and disgusting by modern standards. Toilets, as we know them, didn't exist for common folk. People used privies holes dug outside the house, or simply relieved themselves in the fields. Waste disposal was crude. Refuse and animal droppings often littered the village streets. This lack of sanitation was a major factor in the spread of disease. Imagine living surrounded by filth, with flies buzzing everywhere, carrying pathogens from open waste into your food and water supply. Speaking of water, clean water was rare and precious. Wells were common but often shallow, and easily contaminated by nearby cesspits or animal pens. Rivers and streams served as water sources, but were often polluted. Boiling water wasn't a widespread practice, and germs unseen, but deadly, spread through contaminated supplies. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery and cholera could sweep through villages, killing many, especially children. Food was another harsh reality. The medieval diet for peasants was monotonous and often insufficient. Bread was the staple, dark, coarse, and heavy, often made from rye or barley mixed with other grains. White wheat bread was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Peasants ate what they could grow or gather: beans, cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, and some fruits like apples or berries when in season. Meat was rare because raising animals was expensive, and many were needed for labor or milk, rather than slaughter. Instead, peasants might supplement their diets with eggs, cheese, and occasional fish, especially if living near rivers or coasts. Meals were simple and cooked over the open fire. Porridge and stews made with vegetables, and sometimes scraps of meat or bones were common. Spices were rare and expensive, so flavor was limited. Fasting was also a religious practice, sometimes enforced, limiting what people could eat on certain days, which further strained nutrition. Malnutrition was widespread. Deficiencies in vitamins and minerals led to weak immune systems, stunted growth, and higher vulnerability to disease. Children, pregnant women, and the elderly were especially at risk. During bad harvest years, famine struck hard. Crops failed due to bad weather, pests, or war-related destruction. When famine hit, starvation and death followed. In some years, up to a third of the population could perish from hunger-related causes. Work was relentless and backbreaking. Peasants were tied to the land and the demands of the feudal lord. The agricultural calendar dictated every aspect of life, from planting in spring to harvesting in late summer and preparing fields in autumn. The workload was enormous. Most tools were basic: wooden plows, sickles, hoes, and scythes. Farming methods were primitive and inefficient, relying on animal power and manual labor. The three-field system was a common method of crop rotation, but yields were still low compared to modern standards. Soil depletion, pests, and unpredictable weather made farming a gamble. If the harvest failed, there was no safety net. The lord's demands for taxes and rents didn't lessen, even in hard times. Aside from farming, peasants raised livestock: cows, pigs, chickens, and sheep. Animals were vital not only for food, but also for labor, clothing, and trade. However, animals were vulnerable to disease, theft, and starvation, especially in harsh winters. Life wasn't just physical, it was also social and political. But the average medieval person had very little say. The rigid hierarchy placed the king at the top, followed by nobles, knights, clergy, and at the bottom, the peasants and serfs. Serfs were bound to the land and couldn't leave without permission. They owed labor, goods, and allegiance to their lord, who in turn provided protection, at least in theory. Justice was harsh, and local lords wielded enormous power. Punishments for crimes were brutal: whipping, branding, mutilation, or execution. The law was often arbitrary, and corruption was common. The church played a major role, not just spiritually, but also as a political force, often controlling land and wealth, influencing kings and peasants alike. Daily life was punctuated by religious observance. The church calendar determined festivals, holy days, and fasts. Religion was a source of comfort, but also fear. People believed that misfortune was punishment for sin. Superstition flourished, and accusations of witchcraft or heresy could lead to torture or death. Despite the hardships, medieval communities had a sense of identity and mutual support. Villagers worked together during harvest, festivals, and emergencies. Markets and fairs provided chances to trade, socialize, and escape the monotony. Still, the world outside the village was dangerous. Bandits, war, and political upheaval were constant threats. The medieval period was marked by frequent conflicts, from local feuds to massive wars like the 100 Years' War between England and France. Soldiers were often mercenaries or conscripted peasants with little training. Knights and castles symbolized power, but also war and suffering. Siege warfare was brutal, involving starvation, disease, and cruelty. Civilians suffered as armies pillaged the countryside, burning homes and destroying livelihoods. This was a time when life expectancy was low, averaging around 30 to 40 years, though many died much younger. Childbirth was perilous, with high maternal mortality rates. Infant mortality was devastating, with many children never reaching adulthood. To sum up, medieval life was a constant struggle. The hardships, dangers, and rigid social constraints made it a world few today could endure. The comforts we take for granted, clean water, abundant food, medical care, freedom, were non-existent for most. And the psychological toll of living under such conditions, fear of death, disease, hunger, and oppression was immense. If you think you could survive in medieval times, think again. The reality was harsh, unyielding, and relentless. But by understanding this, we gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience of those who lived through it and the incredible progress humanity has made since. Medieval life was defined not just by struggle and survival, but also by a complex web of customs, beliefs, and social norms that shaped every interaction. To truly understand what it was like, we have to dig into the culture and mindset of the time, peeling back layers of myth to reveal the harsh truths people face daily. Family was the cornerstone of medieval society. Households were typically large, often including extended family members. Children, from a very young age, were expected to contribute to the household's survival, whether through chores, tending animals, or helping in the fields. Childhood, as we understand it today, didn't exist. Many children were treated as miniature adults, expected to work and behave accordingly. Education was rare outside the nobility and clergy. For most, learning was limited to oral tradition, religious instruction, and practical skills needed for survival. Marriage was a strategic institution, heavily influenced by social status and economic needs. Love, while celebrated in songs and stories, was often secondary to alliances between families. For peasants, marriages were arranged to secure land, labor, or protection. Women had few rights and were largely dependent on their fathers or husbands. Their lives were centered around childbirth, child-rearing, and managing the household. The mortality rate during childbirth was frighteningly high, and many women never lived past their early 30s. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The Catholic Church was a powerful force that governed not only spiritual matters, but also social order, education, and even politics. People believed that life was a test of faith, with heaven or hell waiting after death. This belief system helped people endure hardship, but also instilled a deep fear of sin, punishment, and the unknown. Religious festivals and saints' days punctuated the year, offering brief respite from labor. These events combined spiritual observance with communal celebration, including feasting, dancing, and games. Yet the church was also a source of control, enforcing strict moral codes and punishments for deviation. Heresy, blasphemy, and witchcraft accusations were serious crimes, often leading to torture or execution. The idea of honor and reputation was crucial. In a world without centralized law enforcement, personal and family honor often meant the difference between survival and ruin. Feuds between families or villages could last generations, sparked by slights, theft, or disputes over land. These conflicts could erupt into violence at any time, forcing people to live in a constant state of vigilance. At the same time, communal bonds were strong. Neighbors relied on one another for labor exchange, protection, and social interaction. Festivals and markets were vital for maintaining these ties, providing opportunities to trade goods, share news, and escape the monotony of daily toil. Despite the hardships, there was a rich social life embedded in medieval village culture. Work was not limited to agriculture. Craftsmen and tradespeople formed the backbone of medieval towns, which began to grow in size and importance during the later Middle Ages. Blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, and potters produced goods essential for daily life. These skilled workers often belonged to guilds, early forms of professional organizations that regulated trade, quality, and training. The rise of towns and commerce introduced new challenges and opportunities. Markets attracted people from surrounding areas, fostering economic growth, but also disease and social tension. Town life was crowded and dirty, with poor sanitation and limited access to clean water. Yet it offered a degree of freedom and mobility unavailable in the countryside. Medicine in medieval times was a mix of ancient knowledge, superstition, and trial and error. Doctors were rare and often untrained. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies and bloodletting to prayers and charms. Surgery was risky and primitive, with no anesthesia or antiseptics. Many ailments that are easily treated today were death sentences then. The mental and emotional toll of medieval life was immense. Constant exposure to death, disease, and poverty shaped a worldview steeped in fatalism and resilience. People found comfort in faith, community, and rituals, but the psychological burden was heavy. The fear of sudden death or disaster was ever present, shaping decisions and behavior. Despite this, medieval culture produced incredible achievements in art, literature, and architecture. Cathedrals rose as symbols of faith and human ambition. Illuminated manuscripts and epic poems celebrated ideals of heroism and piety. These cultural artifacts remind us that, even in the harshest conditions, human creativity and hope endured. Understanding medieval life means confronting the reality that it was a world very different from ours, physically harsh, socially rigid, and psychologically demanding. It challenges our modern sensibilities and forces us to appreciate the incredible resilience of those who lived through it. To truly grasp what life was like in medieval times and why you really couldn't handle it, we have to explore not only the daily grind, but also the bigger forces that shaped existence, the politics, warfare, and power struggles that constantly loomed over people's heads. The medieval period was anything but peaceful or stable. It was an era defined by conflict on every level, from local disputes to massive, continent-spanning wars. The political landscape was fragmented and volatile. Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, counties, and city-states, each ruled by a lord, duke, king, or bishop with varying degrees of power. Borders were fluid, claims overlapped, and allegiances shifted constantly. This made life unpredictable for ordinary people who lived in border regions or contested lands. One day, your village might be under one lord's rule, and the next, it could be claimed by a rival. Power was personal and decentralized. The king's authority often depended on the loyalty of powerful nobles, who could rebel or switch sides if it suited them. Royal courts were arenas of intrigue, alliances, betrayals, and bloodshed. For common folk, these high-stakes games of power translated into instability. As armies marched, taxes increased, and villages suffered the consequences of political ambition. Wars were a constant reality. From small-scale raids to full-scale invasions, conflict defined the medieval centuries. The 100 Years' War between England and France, the Crusades to the Holy Land, and countless regional skirmishes brought violence to the doorstep of ordinary people. Armies weren't professional soldiers, as we know them today, but often conscripts, mercenaries, or knights with questionable skills. Battles were brutal and chaotic affairs, with high casualties and little mercy. Sieges were especially harrowing. Castles were the ultimate symbols of power, but also prisons and fortresses that could be subjected to months of starvation, disease, and relentless assault. Civilians trapped inside suffered alongside soldiers, facing famine, sickness, and terror. Outside, villagers lived in fear of pillaging armies and bandits who thrived during wartime chaos. Taxes and levies to fund these wars drained peasant resources. Lords demanded not only labor and produce, but also money and men to fight. This economic burden could push communities to the brink of collapse. In bad years, heavy taxation contributed to famines and rebellions. Religion was deeply intertwined with politics and war. The church was a powerful political entity that called for crusades, influenced kings, and controlled vast lands. Religious justification was often used to rally people to battle, framing conflicts as holy wars. This fusion of faith and violence added a layer of complexity and dread to medieval life. Daily existence was overshadowed by these forces beyond personal control. The constant threat of violence, displacement, and hardship bred a culture of caution, loyalty, and sometimes desperation. People developed strategies to survive politically, as well as physically, navigating allegiances and favor to protect their families. Despite this, life continued. Markets buzzed, festivals occurred, and people loved, laughed, and dreamed even in the darkest times. The resilience of the medieval spirit was remarkable, but the harsh reality was that few lived long enough or comfortably enough to truly escape the era's brutal grip. Life in the medieval period was an unforgiving test of endurance, resilience, and submission to an intricate social order that left almost no room for personal freedom, especially for the vast majority who were peasants and serfs. To understand why modern people would struggle and often fail to handle life back then, you must imagine a world where every day was a challenge, fraught with hardship, danger, and despair. Imagine waking up before dawn in a small, cramped, smoky cottage made from wattle and daub, with a thatched roof barely protecting you from rain and cold. The floor is dirt, covered in rushes that have been trampled and stained with years of use. Your bed is a pile of straw or a thin woolen blanket on a wooden frame. You breathe in the thick, smoky air from last night's fire, which serves both to heat and cook your meager meals, but fills your lungs with soot. Your home is shared with your entire family, sometimes spanning 3 or 4 generations, all huddled together for warmth and safety. Privacy is non-existent. Personal space is a luxury. The stench of unwashed bodies, smoke, animal dung, and rotting refuse fills the air. Disease lurks unseen in every corner. Fleas and lice crawl in your hair and on your skin, tormenting you with incessant itching and spreading deadly illnesses. Your daily diet consists mostly of coarse bread made from rye or barley, often supplemented with watery pottage, a stew made from legumes, cabbage, and whatever scraps of vegetables or meat you can scavenge. Meat is a rare luxury, reserved mostly for the wealthy. You drink ale or weak beer, as clean water is a precious commodity, often contaminated by animal waste or human excrement. Many in your village have fallen ill from dysentery or typhoid because of this. From the moment you're old enough to work, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, you toil in the fields under the watchful eyes of the Lord's bailiff. You plow the land with a wooden plow pulled by oxen, plant crops by hand, tend livestock, and harvest under the scorching sun or in freezing rain. The work is backbreaking, relentless, and seasonal. There is no downtime, no weekends, no holidays except for religious feast days, which are few and far between. The feudal system binds you to the Lord's land. You cannot leave without permission. You owe him rent, a portion of your crops, and labor sometimes 6 days a week or more. If you fail to pay or work, punishments are severe: fines, imprisonment, or even physical punishment. Justice is harsh and arbitrary, dispensed by local lords, who often act as judge, jury, and executioner. Your social status is fixed. You are born a serf, and you will likely die one. There is no upward mobility, no hope of escape. Education is out of reach. Literacy is reserved for clergy and nobles. Your world is small, limited to your village and surrounding fields. Yet despite these grim realities, life is not without meaning or moments of joy. Family bonds are strong. Community festivals, religious ceremonies, and market days offer rare relief and social connection. Folk tales, songs, and dances provide entertainment and preserve cultural identity. Religion offers solace and hope, even as it enforces conformity and fear. But the psychological toll of this existence is profound. Constant exposure to death, whether from disease, famine, or violence, creates a worldview steeped in fatalism and endurance. Fear of divine punishment and hope for salvation dominate minds. The Church's power permeates all aspects of life, controlling morals, laws, and social behavior. The reality of medieval life shatters any romantic notions you might have. It was a world defined by hardship, inequality, and a brutal struggle for survival that tested every human capacity. If you think you could handle it, the truth is, you probably couldn't. Life in the medieval period was a relentless struggle that demanded not only physical stamina, but an unyielding spirit to endure the many hardships that defined existence. The world was not shaped for comfort or ease. Rather, it was a place where survival depended on navigating a complex web of social, economic, and environmental challenges that we can barely imagine today. To really understand why you couldn't handle medieval life, you have to start at the ground level, where the reality was brutal and uncompromising. Imagine a typical morning in a small medieval village. The sky is still dim with the faint light of dawn, but the day has already begun for most of the inhabitants. The air is sharp and cold, especially in autumn or early spring. You wake up on a bed made of rough straw stuffed into a simple wooden frame, your body stiff and aching from a night's sleep on a hard surface. Around you, the walls of your home, a hut made of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof, are coated in soot from the fire that never fully died down overnight. The smell of smoke clings to your clothes and skin, mixing with the damp earthiness of the mud floor beneath your feet. Your family is already stirring. Children, some no older than 5 or 6, are rising to begin their chores. In this world, childhood is short and merciless. There is no playtime to speak of, no luxury of innocence. From a very young age, every member of the household is expected to contribute to the survival of the family unit. Your mother is tending the fire, preparing a simple, watery pottage made from barley or oats, and a few scraps of vegetables. Meat is scarce, and reserved for special occasions or the Lord's table. The smell is bland, barely sustaining, but it is what you have. Outside, the village is coming to life. The narrow, uneven paths are slick with mud from recent rains, and the air is thick with the odor of manure and refuse. There is no sanitation system. Waste is tossed into open ditches or the nearby river, which also serves as the primary source of drinking water, ensuring disease is never far away. The sounds of roosters crowing, dogs barking, and the lowing of cattle fill the air, punctuated by the occasional shout of a villager calling for help or warning of approaching danger. Your first task is to tend the animals. The cattle, sheep, and pigs are not your pets, but vital sources of food, clothing, and income. You guide them to pasture, always wary of predators or thieves. Guard dogs accompany you, but even they offer limited protection in this harsh world. The fields await next. You and your family spend hours plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting, using simple wooden tools and animal labor. The soil is heavy and often rocky, making work slow and exhausting. Rain or shine, you labor from dawn until dusk, your hands cracked and bleeding, your back bent under the weight of constant toil. The seasons dictate your workload and ultimately your survival. Famine is a looming threat every year. Bad weather, crop failure, or war can devastate food supplies. When the harvest is poor, hunger spreads quickly. Malnutrition weakens bodies, especially among children and the elderly, making them vulnerable to disease. Starvation is a reality many face silently, their bodies wasting away while the Lord demands his share of the crops. The social order reinforces this hardship. As a serf, you are legally bound to the Lord's land. You cannot leave or seek better conditions without permission. You owe him labor, often 6 days a week or more, and must give a portion of your produce as rent. The Lord provides protection and justice, but his benevolence is limited and often self-serving. Punishments for failing to meet obligations can be severe: fines, flogging, imprisonment, or expulsion. In the village, everyone watches everyone else. Gossip spreads quickly, and reputations are fragile. Social cohesion is necessary for survival, but it also means constant scrutiny and limited personal freedom. Disputes over land, water rights, or accusations of theft can escalate quickly, sometimes resulting in violence or legal repercussions. Religion permeates every aspect of your life. The church wields immense power, offering hope of salvation, but also enforcing strict moral codes. You attend Mass regularly, confess sins, and observe holy days, which provide rare breaks from labor. Clergy hold authority not only spiritually, but also politically, controlling land and resources. The fear of divine punishment is a constant weight, shaping behavior and belief. Health is precarious. Disease is ever present and often fatal. Plagues sweep through villages with terrifying speed, killing a large portion of the population. Medical knowledge is rudimentary and often dangerous. Remedies include herbal concoctions, prayers, and rituals, but cures are rare. The death of family members, neighbors, or even children is a frequent tragedy that leaves deep scars. Despite all this, life continues. Human resilience manifests in small joys: storytelling by the fire, communal feasts during festivals, and the hope passed down through faith. But make no mistake, this was a world where life was cheap, suffering was routine, and only the strongest or luckiest survived. The medieval world was, in many ways, a battlefield not only between kingdoms or armies, but within the very fabric of everyday life. For most people, survival was a constant test of will, endurance, and acceptance of a harsh social order that left little room for personal freedom or comfort. As we dive deeper into what life was really like, it becomes clear why a modern person simply couldn't handle the relentless hardships of medieval existence. First, consider the harshness of the environment itself. Unlike today's modern cities with paved roads, sanitation, and clean drinking water, medieval towns and villages were grim, crowded, and filthy places. Streets were little more than muddy paths, clogged with animal waste, garbage, and the runoff from homes and shops. In some cases, cesspits were emptied directly into the streets or rivers. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of rot, smoke, and human waste that would assault your senses from the moment you stepped outside. Disease was an ever-present specter. The absence of proper sanitation, combined with close living quarters and a lack of medical knowledge, made epidemics inevitable. The Black Death, which wiped out as much as a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, is the most infamous example, but plagues, typhus, smallpox, and dysentery were common scourges. The average lifespan was short, often under 40 years, with infant mortality shockingly high. People expected to lose many children in their families, a brutal reality that shaped the emotional landscape of medieval life. Nutrition was poor and monotonous. The majority of the population were peasants who subsisted on a diet dominated by bread, porridge, and vegetables like cabbage, onions, and beans. Meat was a luxury for most, consumed rarely, or reserved for special occasions and festivals. Fish was often eaten, but fresh fish was only available near rivers or coasts. The scarcity of food and poor quality led to widespread malnutrition and weakness, making people even more vulnerable to disease and physical exhaustion. Work was unending and backbreaking. For peasants, the cycle of the seasons dictated life. From early spring through late autumn, the fields demanded constant attention: plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting. Tools were rudimentary and labor-intensive. You would use a wooden plow, heavy and inefficient compared to modern equipment, drawn by oxen or horses. Your hands would be raw and blistered from wielding hoes and sickles. Long hours in the sun, rain, or cold were typical, with little rest. Winter brought some respite, but cold, hunger, and illness made even that season a harsh test. Your social status determined nearly everything about your life. Born a peasant, you remained one tied legally to the land as a serf, obligated to serve your lord and pay rents in crops or labor. This feudal system was a rigid hierarchy, with nobility and clergy occupying the top tiers, enjoying privileges and wealth that were unimaginable to common folk. Lords lived in stone castles, feasted on rich food, wore fine clothes, and wielded political power. You, meanwhile, lived in a mud hut, clothed in rough wool, and toiled endlessly for a fraction of what you produced. Justice was harsh and arbitrary. The lord of the manor held judicial authority over his serfs and peasants. Courts met infrequently, but punishments for offenses like theft, insubordination, or poaching could be brutal floggings, mutilation, or imprisonment. Trials were often based on accusations, witness testimony, or even ordeals, like carrying hot irons or plunging hands into boiling water, tests believed to invoke divine judgment. Legal protections were minimal, and corruption or abuse of power by local lords was common. Religious life permeated every moment. The church was the dominant institution, controlling education, moral conduct, and community life. Attendance at Mass, participation in sacraments, and strict observance of religious holidays and fasting were mandatory. The clergy wielded influence over kings and peasants alike, often owning vast estates and wealth. Fear of eternal damnation and hope for salvation shaped behaviors, with superstition and belief in miracles, or witchcraft, also playing significant roles. Despite these hardships, medieval people found ways to create meaning and community. Festivals, fairs, and religious celebrations offered relief from the monotony and labor. Music, storytelling, and dance provided moments of joy and social connection. Craftsmen and merchants in towns carved out new economic niches that slowly eroded the rigid feudal system, paving the way for future social changes. But through it all, life was a daily grind, where death, disease, hunger, and oppression were constants. If you think you could step into that world and handle it with ease, the truth is, you almost certainly could not. The medieval mindset was shaped by endurance, fatalism, and submission to an order much harsher and more unforgiving than anything most modern people have ever faced. Life in the medieval world was defined by its relentless challenges and brutal realities. To modern eyes, steeped in comfort, technology, and rights, the medieval experience seems almost unimaginable. But for the millions who lived through these centuries, hardship was the norm, and survival depended on endurance, resilience, and a rigid acceptance of their place within an unforgiving social order. If you think of the Middle Ages, you might picture knights in shining armor, grand castles, and epic battles. Yet, for the vast majority of people, the reality was starkly different. Cramped, smoky homes, long days of back-breaking labor, constant threats from disease and starvation, and little hope for a better life. This part of the script peels back the romanticized veneer to reveal what daily life was really like, why it was so harsh, and why modern people would struggle to cope with the medieval world. Consider first the living conditions. Most people lived in small villages or on manors, in homes made from materials easily available: wood, mud, straw, and stone for the wealthiest. These homes were poorly insulated and had no windows with glass. Instead, small openings might be covered with animal hide or cloth to keep out wind and rain. The only source of heat came from an open fire in the center or corner of the home, used for both cooking and warmth. This fire produced thick, choking smoke that lingered in the low-ceilinged rooms, blackening the walls and making breathing difficult, especially during winter months when the fire burned constantly. The floors were often just packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw for some insulation and to soak up moisture. But these coverings were rarely changed and quickly became damp and foul-smelling, attracting fleas, lice, and other vermin that fed on human inhabitants and spread disease. Privacy was non-existent. Families, sometimes including extended members, crowded into a single room. Sleeping arrangements were basic, with straw-filled mattresses or simple pallets laid out on the floor. Personal hygiene was minimal due to scarcity of clean water and cultural norms. Water itself was a precious resource, often drawn from wells or nearby streams, which were also used for bathing, washing clothes, and disposing of waste. This contamination of water sources made outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid frequent and deadly. Bathing was infrequent, and the medieval understanding of cleanliness was rudimentary, tied more to religious rituals than to health. Nutrition was poor and unvaried. The peasant diet consisted mainly of coarse bread made from rye or barley, porridge, and legumes. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and leeks were common. Meat was scarce, usually reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. Fish was more commonly eaten in coastal or riverine areas, but still not a daily staple for most. The lack of variety and nutrients led to widespread malnutrition and stunted growth, especially in children. Labor was brutal and unending. Life followed the seasons, with the agricultural calendar dictating every hour. From before sunrise to after sunset, peasants worked the land using simple tools, wooden plows, hoes, sickles, and animal power. The work was exhausting, involving bending, lifting, and repetitive motions that took a heavy toll on the body. Injuries and chronic pain were common, but medical care was primitive. Wounds often became infected, and treatments ranged from herbal remedies to superstitious rituals, with little success. The social hierarchy entrenched this hardship. Born a serf, you were legally tied to the lord's manor, obliged to provide labor and a portion of your crops. Lords were the local authorities, dispensing justice and protection, but also extracting heavy rents and taxes. Peasants had little autonomy, limited legal rights, and no ability to improve their social standing. The church played a dual role, offering spiritual solace and community, but also reinforcing social order and obedience. The constant presence of death shaped medieval consciousness. Plagues, famines, and wars regularly decimated populations. Infant mortality was high, and life expectancy was short. Funerals and burials were community events, reminders of life's fragility. People lived in a world where suffering and loss were daily companions. Despite this, medieval people cultivated community and culture. Festivals, fairs, music, and storytelling provided moments of joy and escape. Religious life offered hope of salvation and meaning beyond suffering. Over time, towns and trade grew, slowly transforming the social and economic landscape. But none of this diminishes the fact that medieval life was harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving. Modern comforts, rights, and knowledge make it nearly impossible for most of us to imagine living then, and that's why you can't handle it. The deeper you go into the medieval world, the more clearly it becomes a realm completely alien to modern sensibilities. Every comfort you take for granted today, clean water, privacy, freedom of choice, safety from arbitrary punishment, was rare, fragile, or entirely absent. And perhaps nowhere is that contrast sharper than in the systems of law, punishment, personal rights, and psychological survival that defined the later medieval centuries. Imagine living in a world where guilt could be determined by ordeal. A neighbor accuses you of stealing grain. There are no security cameras, no forensics, no defense attorney waiting to build your case. Instead, your name is brought before the local manorial court or a traveling justice. And now, you're told the way to prove your innocence is to plunge your arm into boiling water, then wait a few days. If your wound heals cleanly, God has shown you're innocent. If it festers, as wounds often do, you're guilty. Justice by fire, water, or combat. Trial by jury existed in some places, yes, But the reach of law varied wildly, and it often relied on customs, confessions, and the opinions of powerful men. What's worse is that you're not truly a free individual under the law. Most peasant serfs were part of the property of the land. You owed your labor to your lord, often several days a week, in addition to tending your own tiny strip of land. You had to pay to grind grain at the lord's mill, bake bread in the lord's oven, and use his press to make wine or oil. You paid to marry, paid to inherit, paid when your livestock grazed or drank, and paid in both coin and kind. In lean years, this could mean turning over your last sheaf of grain even while your children went hungry. There were no formal police forces. Law was enforced by local officials, militias, and sometimes by the Lord's men. Feuds could erupt into violent retaliation. Banditry was common, especially on the roads between villages and towns. Traveling even short distances came with risks, highwaymen, hostile neighbors, or just the misfortune of being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Women, too, lived under layers of restriction. Their roles were largely domestic, raising children, managing the household, working in the fields during harvest, and they were under legal authority of father, husband, or later, sons. Marriage was more an economic contract than a matter of love. Widows might briefly gain some autonomy, but most women lived and died under male control, and their health risks were severe. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. There were no antibiotics, no sterilization procedures, no trained obstetricians, just midwives, luck, and prayer. Then consider mental health. The concept didn't exist. Depression, trauma, hallucinations, all were seen through religious or superstitious lenses. People who behaved abnormally might be thought possessed, cursed, or sinful. Madness was feared, mocked, or hidden. There were no therapies, no escape. Even grief had a formal, religious script. And if your sorrow went too long or too deep, others might believe you had invited dark forces into your soul. In towns, life was faster, but not easier. As trade grew, cities sprang up, offering new opportunities and new dangers. Narrow streets packed with bodies, animals, and refuse. Constant fire risks due to wooden buildings and open flames. Epidemics spread rapidly in the cramped conditions. Guilds controlled economic life, and if you weren't part of one, you struggled to find work. Foreigners and outsiders were often treated with suspicion or outright hostility. Xenophobia, fear of Jews, accusations of heresy, these weren't abstract prejudices. They led to massacres, burnings, and expulsion. Fear was not just physical, it was existential. The church taught that your eternal fate depended on your actions, your penance, and your obedience. Hell was real and terrifying. Demons could possess you. Saints could protect you, but only if you were worthy. Everything from bad weather to miscarriage to crop failure could be interpreted as a punishment from God. Astrology, relics, indulgences, and relic-driven pilgrimages became part of how people tried to make sense of life's constant suffering. And yet, people endured. They married, they sang, they danced at festivals. They built cathedrals that soared toward heaven with aching devotion. They wrote poems, illuminated manuscripts, carved grotesques into stone, and filled the darkness with chants. Hope clung to belief. Communities held together through shared rituals and hard-won solidarity. But the burden of daily life, the cold, the hunger, the illness, the injustice, was immense. You, living today, would struggle to last a week in this world. You would recoil from the smells, the lack of sanitation, the absence of choice. You would find the labor unmanageable, the food unsatisfying, the rules suffocating. There was no safety net, no comfort when your body failed, no one to appeal to when you were wronged by someone more powerful. This was a world where resilience wasn't an inspirational quote. It was a necessity to avoid breaking under the weight of unrelenting hardship. By the time we reach the closing chapter of what life was truly like in the medieval world, one thing should be abundantly clear. This was not a time of passive discomfort or quaint difficulty. It was a full-blown crucible of human endurance, one that most modern minds and bodies are no longer built to withstand. To understand why the medieval period was so relentless, it's not enough to list its hardships. You have to imagine living it hour by hour, breath by breath. Every day you woke up not to a buzz from an alarm clock, not to a hot shower, not to a refrigerator full of breakfast choices, but to the creaking of a cold wooden door, a frigid draft sweeping through your drafty thatched hut, and a growling stomach that had grown used to disappoint. Hunger wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was routine. It followed the cycles of the seasons. A bad harvest wasn't an economic inconvenience. It could mean the death of a third of your village. And hunger wasn't just a matter of eating less. It warped your body, stunted your growth, dulled your thinking, and slowed your healing. Rickets, scurvy, and pellagra were all common results of nutritional deficiencies. Children were especially vulnerable. Many didn't live to see their 5th birthday. Those who did carried the marks of malnutrition and disease in their bones, teeth, and stature. You also had to navigate the crushing weight of time. Not the pressure of deadlines or emails, but the slow, grinding rhythm of a life ruled by the sun and the soil. There were no shortcuts. If your family needed flour, you harvested grain, threshed it, dried it, and carried it to the Lord's mill, where you paid for the right to have it ground. You couldn't just buy bread. If your child was sick, you didn't take them to a pediatrician. You consulted the village healer or priest, hoping for a poultice or prayer. If they died, you grieved quickly and moved forward. Life didn't pause. In the cities, you might have escaped the land, but not the danger. Workshops, tanneries, and butcher stalls crowded the air with filth. Rats darted between barrels, dogs fought in alleys, and pickpockets slipped hands into purses before disappearing into the chaos. Disease spread faster than news. Merchants locked their doors when plague returned, often leaving the poor to suffer. And fire, always fire, was a constant threat. One stray spark, one overturned lantern, and whole neighborhoods could vanish in smoke and screams. And what of freedom? What of personal choice? You were born into your station, and for most people, that meant never rising above it. A blacksmith's son became a blacksmith. A serf's daughter married another serf. Ambition was dangerous. Travel was rare. Education was limited. Literacy was a privilege. Books were hand-copied on parchment, and even those were chained inside churches or monasteries, unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent years learning Latin. To think for yourself was not encouraged. It could even get you executed. Heresy was a crime of the mind, and the penalty was death by fire. Religion dominated everything. It was the lens through which all suffering was explained. Why did your child die? God's will. Why did the river flood your crops? Judgment. Why did your wife not survive childbirth? Original sin. This was a world where even the highest kings bowed to the Pope, where war could be waged in the name of salvation, where questions had answers carved into stone centuries ago, and dissent was treason. Yet through it all, people continued. They built communities. They raised children. They buried their dead with songs and candles. They created music and art and rituals to soften the edges of their brutal reality. Their resilience wasn't romantic. It was absolute necessity. They didn't find meaning in the struggle because it was poetic. They found it because they had no other option. You, in your modern life, cannot fathom this total immersion in hardship. You live in an era of padded walls, digital distractions, instant answers, climate control, healthcare, therapy, and rights. You can change jobs, cities, even countries. You can protest, complain, sue, write, speak out. The medieval person could do none of these things without risking everything. And that's what makes the medieval world so alien and so powerful to remember. It's not just that it was uncomfortable. It's that it was unrelenting. It demanded every ounce of your body and spirit, from the moment you were born to the day you died. This is the end of our long journey into the reality of medieval life. And if you followed this story from the start, it should be clear by now that the past wasn't just different, it was an entirely separate existence. Not just because of the lack of technology or modern comforts, but because of how people saw the world, saw each other, and endured everything it threw at them. To close this story, we need to go deeper, not just into the dirt and disease, but into the mind of the medieval person. You wake up with frost in your hair. It's still dark, but you know the time by the sound of roosters and the ache in your bones. You rub your hands together for warmth and slip on your worn tunic, patched so many times the original cloth is hard to see. You pull on your boots still damp from the day before and step outside. The sky is ash gray. Your breath fogs the air. You are a peasant, born to a long line of peasants. You tend to the Lord's fields, raise your own meager crops in a narrow strip beside your home, and pay taxes in grain, eggs, labor. Your children are all you have, and even they might be taken by disease or war or hunger. One is already buried under the willow behind the chapel. No marker, just a memory. This morning, you walk to the well and find two neighbors arguing. One accuses the other of witchcraft. His cow went dry overnight. You stay quiet. That kind of talk can spread like a spark in dry hay. And you've seen what happens to people when the whispers start. Women dragged from their homes, men tied to posts, a bishop sent from the city, robes flowing, firewood piled high. You pray under your breath that they'll forget it by next week. You pray a lot, even when you don't fully believe. It's safer that way. Work waits. The fields are frozen but must be tilled by hand. The ox is sick, and the Lord won't lend his own. Your wife boils yesterday's root stew again, and you carry a chunk of rough bread in your pocket. There will be no meat this week, or next, unless you trap a hare and don't get caught poaching. You're already behind on your mill fees, and the reeve knows it. Your thoughts are not of dreams or purpose. They are of surviving this week. Making it to spring. Avoiding the cough that's spreading from the smith's hut. Hoping the priest doesn't call a tithe increase. Wondering if your youngest daughter's fever will break. There is no plan beyond today. And yet, you feel joy. A passing joy. When the sun breaks through the clouds. When your children chase geese through mud. When an old man plays a tune on a carved pipe and your neighbors dance in their bare feet. These are the moments that stitch your soul together. They don't last. Nothing here does. But they matter. The church says this life is a test. That suffering is holy. That heaven is the reward for obedience, pain, and humility. You believe this because you must. You don't know how to read, but you know the stories. You've seen the saints on the cathedral walls, bloodied and shining. You've heard the sermons, fear God, love thy neighbor, confess, obey. You don't question the order of the world. What else is there? Now the sun sets, and you return home. Your legs burn. Your hands are raw. Smoke curls from your roof, your wife is inside, and the stew is warm. You sit in the straw with your children. One pulls at your sleeve. Tell us about the night again, they say. And you do. You speak of valor and dragons and golden swords, because it keeps them dreaming. Because if they stop dreaming, they'll notice the lice and the cold and the hunger. You tell the story like your father did, and his father before him. This is the medieval world. Not the pageantry, not the castles, but the day-to-day weight of survival. You had no power, no freedom, no real future. But you still sang. You still loved. You still hoped. That's what makes this story so hard for us to understand today. We are not equipped for that level of vulnerability. We are not prepared to give up control, to live without choice. Most of us would fall apart after just one day in those shoes. We don't even know how to start a fire without a lighter. We panic when our Wi-Fi drops. We complain about lines, traffic, customer service. The medieval world didn't offer apologies. It didn't care if you were tired or cold or scared. It asked one thing: endure. And they did. Millions of ordinary men and women lived through centuries of war, famine, plague, and persecution. They built cathedrals they would never see finished. They crossed oceans without knowing what lay beyond. They carved meaning into a world that rarely gave them justice. They found ways to survive and even thrive in conditions most of us would call unlivable. The next time you read about a knight or a king, remember this. Behind every noble name were hundreds of hands planting fields, grinding grain, feeding animals, stitching clothes, digging graves, raising children, and dying young. Their names are lost, but their world built the one you live in now. History is not a fairy tale. It is not a myth. It is not romantic. It is hard and bloody and beautiful in its defiance of despair. And if you had lived back then, you would not have been a hero. You would have been hungry, dirty, scared, and trying to stay alive.